For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Today we celebrate the feast of Cardinal Saint John Henry Newman, a man who lived his life pursuing the deepest treasures of his life, welcoming into his heart the fullness of who God is, and helping others to do the same. When Newman got here in the early 1850s, at the invitation of the Irish bishops to set up the new Catholic University of Ireland next door at what is now the Molly Museum at Newman House, and then soon thereafter building this church to be the large meeting room and chapel for his university. When he got here, he had been Catholic for about 7 years. He'd been an Anglican priest, raised in the Anglican tradition in England, and through a deep pursuit of the truth in trying to determine who it was God was calling us to be, he left his communion, his church, his pulpit where he preached. He left his work at Oxford. He left it all, including his family and friends, who no longer spoke to him, because he thought this was what God wanted from him. He quickly became a Catholic priest, being ordained by the Pope in Rome, and within a few years was here, hoping to found here in Dublin the Catholic Oxford, that place where the intellectual life in the heart of Ireland would take root and be a place where great ideas and important concepts concerning the needs of the world could be debated and discussed among people studying various disciplines. Not that long thereafter, in the 1870s, he spent only about 5 or 6 years here. Newman went through a period where he wondered if everything he'd ever done in his life was worthless. Nothing he had ever laid his hand to seemed to work. And other than the med school, which was able to issue degrees through the Royal College, other than the med school, the university never flourished because they couldn't issue degrees, and it collapsed. And so much of what he had done in his life, having been relieved of his positions in Oxford, having had big public rows with other English intellectuals, and often appearing to lose, nothing in his life seemed to have been fruitful. And yet within a few years of that moment, he is made a priest cardinal, an advisor to the Pope. And he is, to this day, regarded as one of the clearest thinking, most important theologians in the history of the church, and in a couple of 100 years, his name will still be mentioned alongside Augustine and Aquinas. That is the man who came here to Ireland to help rejuvenate and create really Catholic education here, hoping, somewhat against hope, to create a class of learned men at the time, but learned men and women who would take their learning in the so-called secular subjects and deeply understand science and engineering and medicine and the arts, and understand them for themselves and be able to engage with the secular intellectuals of their day on equal footing. But ultimately, he knew that education wasn't it alone. Ultimately, he did not fear that sort of training because he knew if one were truly pursuing truth, if one were moving towards the fullness of the unity of all thought, one would be leading or be led to God, be led to Jesus. Newman in his life was perhaps best known for his understanding of and knowledge of the Arian heresy and the Arians of the 4th century. And it was his deepest conviction, and he thought it important, that everyone understand that all theology, all creed, all doctrine develops. And he developed his theory of the development of doctrine. And yet he was no liberal. Some would say he was arch-conservative, and if you cherry-pick a few lines out of his readings, you could find that. And yet others who regard him as the father of the Second Vatican Council, which came over 100 years after most of his writing, others, if you cherry-pick a few of his phrases here and there, would say he was this progressive liberal. All are wrong. And Ian Kerr, one of his biographers, would say he was a radical conservative because he rooted his thinking in the idea that if we were to understand the depth of what we have been given in the tradition, if we were to truly understand what we have been given in divine revelation, we would endlessly be going back to the scriptures and plumbing the depths of what they meant. We'd be going back to the church fathers who in the first several centuries of the Christian era had to plumb the depths of prayer and scripture to answer complex questions about who we are as church, and what we believe. And that Newman was convinced that we couldn't look at some sort of objective teaching strictly, but we had to contextualize all theology within the reality of history and those issues that are confronting us at any given time, and our capacity in language and thought to articulate that which we know. And Newman was convinced that there was a depth of knowledge to be plumbed in divine revelation, and that sometimes what appears to be radical change in what we think isn't so much change, but it's a deeper knowledge, a deeper understanding of what was always there. Much of what was taken up in the Second Vatican Council were things that Newman himself wrote about. Ideas and thoughts and directions and challenges. And the idea of the document on religious liberty is perhaps the most obvious. But all of those major European theologians of the 1920s and 30s and 40s who became the theological advisors of the Second Vatican Council were deeply steeped in Newman and his thought. Newman, if he had one thing to say to us today, is there are no cheap answers. And that if we want something, we have a hermeneutic, we have a means, a lens through which to decide whether what we want, what we think we should do, where we think we're headed as a church, can be viewed through the lens of the church fathers and scripture. And that if we are going to accept some sort of theological or doctrinal development, we do so with the idea that we must be able to draw a tie back to its roots. Without roots, it's just new thinking. Without roots, it's likely to wither. Newman came to the end of his life, somewhat convinced that no one listened to him. And to this day, theologians read Newman to understand the direction we should be taking. This week in Rome, the Synod began, the second session of the Synod of Bishops, somewhat misnamed because it isn't simply bishops. 25% of the voting membership are laymen and women and religious, non-ordained, non-bishops, who are discussing the needs of the church and the world, really plumbing the depths of where God may be calling us, helping us to see what true evangelization will mean in the 21st and 22nd centuries, and calling us to open our hearts to that indwelling of the Spirit. For one thing we know about Newman, he was a charismatic. Not necessarily as we think it today in terms of the style of prayer, but in that fundamental belief that we as a church walk with Christ, but we walk in the power of the Spirit. And so Pope Francis has called the Synod to trust in the Spirit, but he's also called them to open their ears and listen. Listen to the Spirit in their hearts, listen to the Spirit in their collective discussion, and to listen to one another, not be afraid and with preconceived notions of what might come, but in doing so to always, in the way of Newman, trust that if we plumb the depths of the tradition, if we open our hearts to that which we may not have understood yet, but is there, we may get some guiding help and direction from the God who walks with us. It's very important that we understand that in Newman, in his episcopal motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart, a motto which he